Welcome to Premise Podcast. This is your host, Angelos Sophocleous. In this episode, I host Brad Berwin, a postgraduate student in philosophy at the University of Durham. We introduce the theory of political realism, its roots, fundamental ideas, and how it is related to the current political climate. In addition, we comment on how political realism can address certain liberalist challenges. Further, Brad presents and defends an account of modus vivendi, which he argues is compatible with the main tenets of political realism and liberalism. Welcome everyone to this episode of Premise Podcast. Today with me I have Brad Berwin from Durham University. Brad, welcome to Premise Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So Brad received his bachelor's degree from Arizona State University, a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a master's in global politics at Durham University. His main areas of study are in ethics and political normativity. You're currently conducting a postgraduate research degree in the philosophy department at Durham, specifically looking at the topic of virtue ethics and the implications of compassion on our moral duties towards animals and the environment. But your research focus in your bachelor's degree and in your master's degree, given that you completed your master's in global politics, you have a politics background.
Yeah, correct.
Mm-hmm. And you've dealt with liberalism and the theory that we're gonna discuss today, political realism. So in approaching the question on what political realism is, could you explain what that is in some simple terms and how that relates to liberalism and the liberal ideas we have today? I suppose that political realism is not a widely known theory, and that might be partly because current societies or current forms of government are not based on political realism, but are instead based on liberalism. The two, liberalism and political realism, posing certain challenges to each other. So how could you define political realism?
Sure. So political realism, throughout the history of most of Western philosophy, there's essentially been this idea that politics, what legitimizes governments, is essentially something that should be derived from an ethical theory. So we see all the way back to Aristotle, right? His virtue ethics was not only account of our personal actions, but also an account of how we should behave in a political society. You have similarly with John Stuart Mill. He tried to derive, if we start with utilitarianism as the moral framework, then we ought to also apply that to the political sphere to justify how our political societies should be organized. So this has been a long-running idea, sometimes called the ethics first approach. And only recently, in the past about 15, 20 years, has an alternative approach really started to prop up and gain some momentum. And that essentially is this approach that we call political realism. So the idea behind political realism is really just to say that we can essentially provide arguments for justification for legitimate government without reverting back to or having to base that on a preconceived ethical notion.
And as I understand it, so political realism, as I understand it, poses that instead of first trying to agree on a theoretical level on our moral grounds and on the ethics that we're gonna follow when conducting politics or when doing politics or when we try to solve the political or social problems that we face in society. So instead of saying that we reach a consensus before doing politics, political realism says that we can only reach a consensus if we can reach a consensus by doing politics. So it sees this as a procedure. So while liberalism would first say that we first have to agree on what moral grounds we're going to follow before doing politics, political realism does this the other way around. Is that correct interpretation?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the the areas where it seems to conflict with political liberalism is in this area of political liberalism tends to want to start with some preconceived idea or consensus that we have about the rights and wrongs of society, and then from that consensus to form the liberal structure. But one of the main proponents of political realism, one of its main ideas is what's called deep diversity. So as you explained, it's this idea that we can't, because of the heterogeneous nature of societies, today, it's impossible to come to some consensus of that type before we enter into a political engagement. And really, it's the point of politics itself is to actually create the space to actually have that discourse and to come to the consensus. So for the political realist, it doesn't make sense to say that we have this very particular consensus about the goods of society prior to even the start of the political process. And they really think that it's through the process we can come to some sort of a agreement on these types of issues. And so that's one area where it seems to clash with liberalism. And but liberalism does have a lot of very good things to it. I mean, it's basically it supports ideas of freedom, of toleration, lots of things that we don't want to get rid of. So the question is, is there a way to take a political realist framework, this idea that we can justify political institutions on their own grounds, on political grounds, rather than deriving that from a preconceived ethical notion, whether that can be adapted to or be consistent with some sort of liberal framework without having to get rid of political liberalism. And that's where we would get to this idea of liberal realism.
Mm-hmm. You talked of a preconceived ethical notion. That's exactly what a political realism opposes, that any ethical notion can be preconceived or be pre-political. Is that right? Mm-hmm. So does it mean that the political realism goes against the idea of a social contract or the idea of human right declarations, for example, because these seem to be somehow preconceived, like telling someone that once you come into the world, there is always this contract that you abide by, or there are these human rights that you have by virtue of being born. Is this the idea of preconceived?
Right. So actually, I think that political realism actually does the opposite. I think it can make more sense of these ideas than if we were to take those from an ethics first approach. So, for instance, let me just give you two examples of this. So, one of the main, as you mentioned, one of the main political theories is the social contract theory. It's a form of contractarianism, usually when it's applied to the political field. And so one of the ideas.
Could you give a definition of social contract?
Yeah. So contractarianism in general is just the idea that what justifies a normative structure, what we ought to do, is some contract or some way of basically rationalizing something to other people in a way that we get agreement from them. And so that agreement between our justification is what creates the legitimate means of that. So in the field of politics, that tends to be called social contract theory. And that's essentially one of the main ideas, is that in order for a government to be legitimate, it requires a consensus from the people being governed. And one of the areas where we see that this might come away from normative ethics, strictly speaking, is on the ethics first approach. If we say that a political system is justified based on social contract theory, it would mean that we also would require that we have to also defend a normative ethical theory of contractarianism. And this might be a place where it gets a little controversial because there are many people in the field of ethics, especially in academia today, who do think that contractarianism views of normative ethics are correct. Personally, I think there are a few major flaws with them when you get to the point of a theory of personal action. And so to give one example, one of the main normative ethical approaches to contractarianism was that given by Tom Scanlon, sometimes called Scanlonian contractualism. And so this is basically the idea that actions are right if we can justify those actions to other rational agents. So in his view, in his terminology, an action is right so long as no rational person could reasonably reject it. So this is basically his framework for what constitutes right action. The problem with this account of social contractualism, of Scanlonian contractualism, is that it doesn't take account of, for instance, non-human animals or even infants for that matter. So there's certain groups that are not fully rational that we could never in any situation justify our actions to. And so those groups are necessarily left out of this moral framework. And Scanlon himself admits that his framework at best offers an incomplete account of morality, right? So this is a problem for contractualism when it's tries to be pushed into the sphere of normative ethics. But yet, in the political sphere, social contract theory seems to work fine because when we're talking about a political community, we're not usually, non-human animals are not considered, part of that political community. Infants, small children are not considered full members of this community, right? So you become an adult at 18. We might have duties, political duties and obligations towards non-human animals, towards small children, but they're not seen as full members of this community. So social contract theory seems to work in a political sphere where we're only dealing with other rational agents, but it doesn't seem to fully work when we try to move that into the moral sphere, right, as just a pure ethical theory. So that's one area where there's a problem with this ethics first approach, that ethics has to be and politics have to be based in the same grounding. A second area, if you look at it from the other direction, you mentioned human rights, right? So one idea of human rights, the idea that John Locke, the social contract theorist, defends, is that essentially what human rights are moral rights, or what he calls natural rights. So they're these rights that we would ideally have as individuals just in a state of nature, in a hypothetical state of nature, we would have these rights. And so the purpose of a political community is to protect the rights that we essentially already have as humans. But there's a major problem with that side of it too, is that there's a question of, well, where do these moral rights come from, right? So no one's really been able to really give a good response to this. So John Locke himself, he says, famously, that these rights come from God. They're God-given rights, these natural rights we have. And most people who defend a form of natural law theory tend to base this in some argument for the existence of God. So this obviously becomes problematic as a grounding of morality. If we're taking standard secular ethics approach, this is going to be problematic. So there are ways to conceive of human rights that don't imply some pre-existing moral rights, and those we can have within the framework of a political theory without having to postulate moral rights within a moral theory. And so those are two ways that it comes apart from ethical theory. And it's really an area where it seems that because there aren't any good answers to these questions, based on the mainstream account of the ethics first approach, it seems reasonable that we should look into other approaches. And one approach is this political realist approach, which is to say that there are certain concerns in the political realm that don't necessarily equate to the concerns we have in the purely moral, and that we can create a legitimate account of legitimate institutions based purely on these political concerns and not basing it on an ethical theory as such.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So the biggest problem with the ethics first approach, as I see this, well, saying what ethics are and where they come from.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the problem would be clearer with the distinction you just mentioned about moral rights and political rights. So we can perhaps agree that being allowed to vote is a political right, but and that comes from history, does not have any natural origins, or it doesn't come from God. But how can we deal with some moral rights, such as the right to not be tortured? How could the political realist at the same time keep the position that the right not to be tortured is something that is inherent and something that we should that we all have the right to not be tortured, but at the same time reply to the political liberalist who has the challenge of facing the question where the rights come from?
Right. So political realism, it to be clear, it doesn't deny that morality exists, and it doesn't even necessarily deny that moral rights exist if you take a theory of moral rights. So not every ethical theory can defend the intuition that we shouldn't torture, right? You don't necessarily have to defend that based on a moral rights theory. You can defend that based on utilitarian theory. You could defend that based on a virtue ethics theory, right? So there's other ways of defending that separate from just a purely moral rights theory. So if we have difficulty with trying to come up with where moral rights come from, that might be a reason why we may be able to defend that based on a different ethical theory instead. So political realism doesn't say that there's no morality. What it says is that moral claims are not what we're basing our normative approach to politics on. So what justifies political institutions is not the same as these moral claims. And yet another important feature of it is that it means that we can have a different theory, a different kind of normative ethical theory than what our normative theory of politics is. So I said, right, this ethics first approach, one of the main things about it is it requires you to take whatever normative ethical theory you support, and it says that that theory must also be consistent with a theory of what constitutes a legitimate political system. And that's where we see problems, for instance, right? So someone like John Stuart Mill, who thinks utilitarianism is correct normative ethical theory, he's now required to present a utilitarian account of politics, and you get problems, with that, whether, about the tyranny of the majority, right? And you get people like Rawls who say that no, each individual person in the political society has an inviolable right that you can't get rid of just because of a greater benefit to some other members of society. So there's some pushback from this. But the idea with political realism is that you can, for instance, it would be fully consistent to have a moral theory, say virtue ethics, and also a separate theory on account of contractualism, social contract theory, as supporting your political theory. So they can come apart from each other because one is not directly derived from the other. And so I think that's an important feature. Rather than denying that there's morality, it's that we can just accept different accounts of what constitutes correct personal actions and what constitutes a just structure in political institutions.
Mm-hmm. Going back to one of the main differences between liberalism and political realism, which seems to be the idea that we can never reach a consensus on our ideas or our views about politics, about society, about anything before doing politics. And in the political realist view, that's because of what you mentioned, that there is so much diversity of views, so much diversity of ideas in society, that it's extremely difficult or even impossible to reach a consensus. And also, something that I understood by reading your paper is that political realist is what its name says, a realist position in terms of understanding that disagreement and conflict are fundamental aspects of our nature. So we can never reach a consensus on any idea, and that means we can never be free of conflict or free of disagreement.
Yeah, so I mean, the idea is that it doesn't want to make that big of a claim that we can never come to consensus, and this is where we're going to get to these theories of liberal realism. What it wants to say is we can never come to a consensus on what are sometimes called comprehensive conceptions of the good, right? So many different people are going to have different ideas of what constitutes a good life,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where we're going to hit this wall, and that's where a lot of liberal theories, for instance, Rawls' theory, right? He tries to say through this thought experiment. So he comes up with this thought experiment where he says, imagine it's called the original position. He says, imagine we're all in this original position where we don't know who we're going to be in society, what our class is, what our wealth is, what our ethnic or gender is, and he says, let's try to within this hypothetical original position, let's try to come to some agreement about what the right form of distributive justice would be within society. And so he wants to already in this political liberal framework, he wants to try to get some preconceived consensus on what the primary goods are, as he calls it, of society. And this is where political realists say we can't get a preconceived agreement on what these primary goods are, because this is where we're going to meet up with different ideas that different people have that might be equally legitimate ideas about what they consider something that's a good for their life, what they consider to be a good life for them. And so what liberal realism tries to do is try to say, look, can we hold on to this main idea within liberalism that in order for a government to be legitimate, it requires some level of consent of the governed, right? Some level of consensus from the governed,
Mm-hmm.
without trying to make this claim that we can create some consensus about some overall goods of society. Um, and it turns out that there are ways we can get that, where we can have this deep diversity conclusion of political realism be consistent with some forms of liberal frameworks. And so one of those theories is there's two main theories really that have been written about on this. The first one
Mm-hmm.
comes from Judith Shklar in a 1998 book called Political Thought and Political Thinkers. And this is a view uh, that's called liberalism of fear, right? So on this account, she basically says that instead of looking for a consensus on these universal goods, these Rawlsian primary goods, what is a much lower threshold that it seems more realistic that we could reach is rather to just get consensus on essentially on universal evils, right? So the things
Mm-hmm.
that nobody wants rather than the things that individual people uh, think are good. And so she says that the universal evil is cruelty, and that this is what we can create a consensus around. So um, this is something that closely ties into the ideas of the social contract theorist Thomas Hobbes. So he's actually the one who most of these political realist theories derive from. So he essentially gave an account. He was one of the first major social contract theorists, and he gave this idea that he said, consider that we're in this hypothetical state of nature. He said, in this state, people are going to I mean, you're not going to have any protection of being killed, from having stuff stolen from you, and essentially you're not going to be able to produce any goods, anything that is really worthwhile. You're not going to be able to pursue a worthwhile life because you're going to always have this fear of death. of being killed, of being attacked by other people in this state of nature. And he said, so the life of the individual in the state of nature is nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short, right? So this is a famous line from him. And he said, on this basis of this fear of the state of nature, this is what's going to get people to agree to a political society, to enter into a political society where essentially they give up some of the rights they would have in the state of nature, and they give that up in order to live within a political community where they have some protections from other people, but they're also limited in what they can do to the same extent that they would want other people to be limited in what they can do to them, right? So this is the basis for his idea of a consensus. And for him, this was a non-moral account of political theory, right? So he was the first person to really present a non-moral account of this, because he himself happened to be a moral nihilist. He actually didn't think that morality existed as an actual thing in the world. And so he wanted to present an account of legitimate government, but he didn't have a moral basis to go off of. So he had to create a basis that did not rely on that. And that's really the foundation of all these political realist theories. So Judith Shklar clearly takes some basis from him in this idea that she says that the same as him, that what convinces people to agree to this consensus is a fear of the worst kind of evils.
So is that does Shklar and Hobbes say that, have the understanding that humans are inherently evil? So make two questions on this. Do they think that humans are inherently evil? And my second question is, does Judith Shklar use this as a justification of why the state could be justified to intervene in society just to protect humans, protect society from what others can do to them, from the harm that others could have otherwise done to them if the state had not intervened?
Yeah, so I think they do hold that. I mean, certainly Hobbes, he thought that people in a unrestricted state would essentially do every evil thing imaginable, and that we need really this political institution to get people to behave correctly. With Judith Shklar, I think she has a similar view. She especially has she says the main kind of object of this fear that we should be feeling towards the thing is actually the state itself, a state that has too much power, right? So if the state is not restricted by some, for her, an account of political liberalism, then it will act out in ways that harm the people. They'll basically do whatever they can get away with. And she says history has shown us this, numerous times. And so really her account of the liberalism of fear is really an account of restricting the government in a way that liberalism is able to balance out that power of the concerns of the citizens against an unrestricted political institution. So really, in one sense, she's objecting strongly to Hobbes' idea of a sovereign, right? But she does agree with Hobbes' more basic idea that political institutions are justified by a consensus about the harm we would face outside of a political institution.
And in your work, you also mention why such theories oppose anarchy. Does this connect to what we just said, that there must be a state sometimes to intervene when it should?
Right. So I discussed the first of these theories, which is Shklar's liberalism of fear. So this is an account which the philosopher Matt Sleet, he defines this as a negative liberal realism, right? Because it's concerned with this, basically the wrongs, the harms, rather than the goods we want to pursue. But the second account is this account given by John Gray, the account which he calls modus vivendi, and this essentially in Latin is Latin for a mode of living. And so his idea stems from a different parts of Hobbes's account. So Hobbes, in one of his main quotes, the full quote, he says, "The passions that incline men to peace are fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living, and the hope by their industry to obtain them." So we see that Chaclar's account is really focused on this fear of death part, this idea of a fear of summum malum, which is the Latin for the worst wrong, the epitome of badness. So hers is based on that, whereas the modus vivendi account is really based on this second idea, this desire, that really the idea that drives people to consent to political institutions is not the primary desire is not these fears of being attacked, of death and stuff, but it's really a desire to be able to live a good life, right? So within this state of nature, you're not able to pursue any of the goods that you would want, because you would always be defending your product from any person who might want to rob you or kill you, and you would never be able to, for instance, be a philosopher, right? And this, you'd be confined to a hunter-gatherer society, and so really it's this desire to of people to be able to pursue a good life. This is what a different conception of the main reason why people want to enter into a political institutions, because that's the only way they would ever be able to pursue the good things in life. And this is where the account of modus vivendi really bases itself on this second proposition. And so what this modus vivendi account seeks is really consensus on the basic conditions of peaceful coexistence. And so to get to your idea of anarchy, so this is really a difference between the liberalism of fear and the modus vivendi account, is that the liberalism of fear would, as I said, Chaclar said one of the main worries is actually the political government itself. So that's where she focuses on a government unrestrained, and then the harms that this could do to people. But John Gray thinks that there's just as much of a worry about no society at all, right? About being in a state of nature, a state of anarchy, because this also would inhibit our ability to pursue a good life. So this is where there's some differences between these two accounts. So yeah, so one of them, Judith Chaclar, is not so much worried about the state of anarchy as she is about a state of unrestrained government. But John Gray still very much would be concerned about the problems faced within an anarchic situation.
So modus vivendi seems to stem from the understanding that there is a plethora of different kinds of good life that one can have. While it seeks to advance the good life, it doesn't say what a good life is, in contrast to other theories. It doesn't try to promote a particular way of life or lifestyle, or say what the good life is.
Right.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Right. So in John Gray's his book, Two Faces of Liberalism, where he defines this theory, he talks about the emphasis on the liberal idea of toleration, right? And so he says that the ideas about the good life is we live in pluralistic societies, and that there isn't necessarily one conception of the good life that's better than others. People can be living different lives that are equally good, right? And so he doesn't want to restrict that in his account. So really, what his account is sometimes referred to as a minimal approach to political realism. What he's concerned with is just getting a consensus on the conditions where we can peacefully coexist, but still maintain different ideas about what the good life entails. So this really allows for numerous different ideas about the good life to exist, and for individuals within a society to pursue their own conception of that good life, how they choose within a basic consensus about peaceful coexistence with one another. So one of the implications of this account is actually that it may allow for some non-liberal regimes to also be legitimate institutions. And this is something that some liberals, for instance, Judith Shklar was what John Gray would call a fundamentalist liberal, where she thinks that what's required is that every society, necessarily needs to be liberal in order to protect us from this cruelty, potential cruelty of unrestrained government, and that a liberal society is the best way to obtain that. Whereas the modus vivendi account, interestingly, allows for the possibility of some legitimate non-liberal societies, and this comes back to John Gray's fear about anarchy. And so he sees that in some instances, the trying to force a democratic system onto another nation sometimes creates a larger conflict than it helps to solve. And so one of the areas where we really see this in present day is in Somalia. So in Somalia, in the 60s, the Europe and the West tried to implement a democratic system in this country, and this was ended up being overthrown by a military dictator who ruled until the early 1990s, when he was again overthrown, and this launched the country into basically a state of anarchy. It created a failed state in this region, and since then the West has continued to attempt to install a democratic system in this country, but they've ignored kind of the culture of the region, which is based on these deep-seated clan affiliations. Most of the people in Somalia are pastoral people, and they're very very committed to individual clans within their regions, and they don't recognize a national centralized government structure, or they don't have a single national identity in that way that this system is able to work there. So they've rejected time and time again this attempt at a democratic system in the country, and it's seen more instability in the country. So for someone like John Gray, this attempt at promoting a liberal system is actually an illegitimate system, because it's created a place with less hospitable to a peaceful coexistence between people, right? So even though it's pursuing a liberal ideal, if it's not promoting peaceful coexistence, it doesn't constitute a legitimate form of government. And so this is a place where, again, the modus vivendi account would disagree with an account like the liberalism of fear, because modus vivendi also recognizes this very big worry about the lack of government altogether, which is what we essentially see, this breakdown of government in Somalia, which has caused a lot of harm, and that is, again, counter to what modus vivendi would require of a legitimate system of governance.
So we see basically liberalism in practice in the case of Somalia. So it's like the West, or some Western countries had already decided before even intervening in Somalia what the right system of government is, and that's the notion of the preconceived or the pre-political that we discussed earlier. They did not try to find the right approach through engaging in the country or talking to the locals or understanding how social groups work there. And some Western countries said a centralized government, it's the only right form of government that the country can have. Therefore, we're going to impose this system of government. And that shows why liberalism in that case didn't work, because it essentially tried to impose Western values to a country which is, of course, not Western, and it doesn't follow Western values, and its social structure is sometimes fundamentally different from what we are used to here in the West. As you said, they have the clan system. from reading your work, I realized that they have some sort of unelected group of elders that takes decisions about the country. So they also have some respect for the elderly population that allows the elderly to take decisions about the country. So it is it's a fundamentally different way of governing the country.
Right. So this is really what happened in the northern part. So within in Somali culture, you have these clans, and these clans are basically ruled by the clan elders, and they're the ones that have the political power within these clans, and they're seen as the legitimate authority within these societies. And so what happened was when we attempted to build this liberal system there, we ignored the clan politics. We kind of propped up one of the clans. There's three major clans there at least, and some other minor ones. And we propped up one of those clans, essentially made that person the president. He has no legitimacy within the other clans, or even within a lot of his own clan, because he doesn't meet the general structure. And so then we're surprised when this system fails and the people of Somalia don't accept this new political leader we've said is now in charge of their entire country. But so what you see interestingly is in the northern part of Somalia, which has now formed its own breakoff region called Somaliland. You see a self-sustaining and self-functioning government working up there, and this was created with little interference from the Western powers. Essentially, after the Civil War broke out in the early 90s here, the northern region essentially tried to stop the fighting there. And what causes a lot of this fighting is that these clans also have blood feuds. So you kill one of their clan members, and now they have a blood feud to exact a revenge against your clan. And so this becomes a never-ending cycle of blood feuds back and forth. And this is what is causing much of this fighting in Somalia. In the northern Somalia and Somaliland, what they did was they created a council of reconciliation, and they said, let's get all the clans together that are in this region, and let's get the clan leaders, let's involve the clan elders and the clan leaders in the system, and get them to agree to drop all these blood feuds and get to a point where we can get to essentially create a stable conditions for cooperation. And that's exactly what they did. And what they've created in that northern region is a stable system, which is essentially made up of a bicameral legislature. So this is made up of a lower elected house and an upper unelected house of essentially these clan elders. And this is a system that by Western standards fails to be liberal in the sense that we tend to see it, because there is this unelected body, but it works for their system, and it takes account of their cultural and societal norms in a way that brings stability to their region. And so for a modus vivendi account, that is would constitute a legitimate form of government, whereas some forms of liberalism, when they see only liberalism as creating a legitimate form of government, they would see this as in some ways illegitimate, because it does not take a standard preconceived liberal structure, as we mentioned before, that some of these accounts want to have this idea of a single primary good, and trying to force that onto other societies. We see that has not been the thing that's created the most stability in that region.
Mm-hmm. So it's of course the case that we should take into account each country's or each society's morals or lifestyle or way of organizing themselves. But so far we talked about how political realism can be applied on the political level, but on the moral level, we can be sure that there are some countries in certain regions of the world which do not respect freedom or are intolerant towards others. And I wouldn't say that we should adopt a moral relativist position in saying, for example, female genital mutilation is a practice that is respected by certain countries in the world. Therefore, it's fine for them to organize their system under FGM. So how can we be sure that under political realism, a country or a state is able to organize itself in the way it wants, but at the same time respecting freedom and being tolerant towards others and having all these values that we call Western values primarily?
Sure, sure. So on the most of Vivendi account, as I said, the primary concern of this is enabling people to pursue their own conception of a good life. So something like a culture which half of its population is subject to female genital mutilation, right? That's not conducive to a pursuit of a good life, at least for that segment of the society. So that would not necessarily meet the criteria of a legitimate government system on the modus vivendi account. So it does have limitations, right? This account will have limitations, and those limitations essentially are that any legitimate institution has to protect those most basic means of actually pursuing a good life. And when its survival depends on a systematic injury to a wide range of these basic interests, it becomes illegitimate. So there have been many papers written about FGM and this problem. And so there's even questions about whether you can call this a cultural norm of the society, because when you're in a society where half the population doesn't have a right to actually express their views, right? The cultural norm of FGM was created by the men within that society. There's a question of whether that even constitutes a cultural norm in a really an objective sense of that it's something that the entire society has agreed to, rather than something that half the society has been left out of the discussion on whether they want this norm or not. So there are definitely problems with human rights violations of this nature. But yeah, I think an account that allows for some forms of non-liberal regimes can still have protections against basic human rights abuses of this nature.
And on that, another central aspect of the modus vivendi approach is that, as Gray says, that human rights are timeless or time bound. So
Yeah.
depending, could you expand on that a bit?
Yes. So this gets back into this discussion of moral rights versus political rights. So there's the idea that we discussed earlier about that human rights are derived from these more primary moral rights that we have. But there's another conception, which is a purely political conception. This is saying we can defend the idea of universal human rights without defending them based on some existence of moral rights underpinning those. And this is a position that Gray defends, and he says, right, that human rights are unavoidably time bound, right? So they're one of the examples he uses in this to express is Article 24 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This article ensures reasonable limitations on the working hours and periodic holiday with pay, right? So this obviously periodic holiday with pay and limited and reasonable working hours wouldn't have made sense, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago in a hunter-gatherer society, right, where people, the work is interrelated with every aspect of their life, right? So that, what does a holiday, periodic holiday with pay mean for a hunter-gatherer society? So clearly that seems to be a right that today might be considered universal, but it's certainly not universal in a timeless sense, in the sense that it was something that applied to people 3,000 years ago. And so this is what the political philosopher Joseph Raz calls this synchronically universal. And this essentially means that something can be universal in the sense that it reflects the rights of all people living today, rather than universal in a sense of a timeless universal nature. And that's the way that that Gray and some other political philosophers see human rights, rather than attempting again to defend them based on an ethics first approach, that they have to kind of relate to some moral rights.
And closing, how would you view the current political climate based on the political realist account? Because we see that on the political realist account, its understanding of conflict and disagreement as not only being fundamental to human nature, but considering conflict and disagreement as the way we are going to come to a consensus or come to agreement on certain issues. Instead, the current political climate avoids conflict, avoids disagreement. Before we even start discussing, we assume that the other person follows the same rationality as us, or they have reached the same conclusion as us. So in my view, we have a fear of conflict. What would be your take on that?
Right. So right now we do have what we could see as a breakdown of cooperation, especially with the polarity of political parties and in many countries, especially a lot of Western countries now. And so really, I think important, domestically within these countries is to I think this idea of consensus on the conditions of cooperation is really something that needs to be emphasized more in today's society. But I also think this has important implications for moral theory and for liberalism in general, to this idea that we can separate our justification of political systems from our justification of moral systems. And also, it makes us rethink the ideas of liberalism. So a lot of people believe, a lot of liberal thinkers believe that a liberal theory allowing for the legitimacy of non-liberal regimes makes it no longer consistent with political liberalism, and I think this is wrong. I think that you can have a liberal theory that allows for non-liberal regimes and still is consistent with the liberal framework. And you saw that John Rawls, one of the main liberal thinkers of the 20th century, he wrote a book on international theory called The Law of Peoples, and in this he similarly said that we should allow for some non-liberal regimes, the legitimacy of some non-liberal regimes, and he got a lot of blowback from people saying this is inconsistent with his other works on political liberalism. But I think that you can see with both the account of modus vivendi and with Rawls' Law of Peoples that it really is consistent with ideals of liberalism, and it's especially consistent with the liberal ideal of toleration. And so in promoting an idea of toleration within a liberal theory, that includes allowing some forms of non-liberal regimes to exist and to justly exist.
Great. So, Brad, I would really like to thank you for your participation in the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot. You have just listened to Premise Podcast. Subscribe to Premise Podcast on YouTube and make sure to follow the podcast on Twitter and Facebook. The podcast is also available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Soundcloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. Please consider supporting Premise Podcast on Patreon to help bring philosophy to the public. See you next week. Thanks for listening.